So I remember a story that I read when I was in my 20s and, thinking about priesthood, going into the seminary, all of that thing, all the stuff that associated with what we call discernment. But this story, though, never left me. And I think it's an important story for me because it forms the way I think about faith and God and my priesthood. And whenever I'm thinking about things, especially of faith, this story comes back right away. That's how important I think it is to me. Like a lot of the other stories that you always hear me talk about. But the story goes like this. Once there was a circus that came to town, and everyone was there to watch the show. So the ringmaster, comes out into the crowd, and he looks way up into the top of the tent there, and he says, "You see that man there on that unicycle? Let's have a show of hands. How many of you believe that that man can go across that high wire on a unicycle without even a safety net? How many of you believe he can do that?" Now the crowd had been, seeing some great things there. I mean, they're at a circus, right? That's what you see when you're at a circus. So everybody raised their hand. And then the ringmaster said, "Great. Now how many of you have enough faith in him that you would be willing to get on his shoulders when he does it?" And guess how many people raised their hands? And I think for me, that was when I read the story, the point is the difference between just believing and having real faith. Many people say they believe, and it's really kind of easy to believe. A lot of people, when I'm talking to them, and they're saying that, that why they don't go to church. But I believe, and, it takes no effort really to believe. It's just a statement of faith. But now to have faith, that's something different. To have faith means you're willing to risk your life. It means that you are willing to put your life in the hands of someone else. And I think we know that because it means one thing to say that you believe your children or your friend or your spouse, and another thing to say that you have faith in him or her. And our faith in God, it can be the difference between being a spectator and playing the game. It is one thing to sit in the stands and watch others win or lose a football game. It's quite another thing to be a player on the field and you win or you lose. Looking at the gospel, we see that the apostles asked Jesus to increase their faith. Now that's a beautiful thing to do. We should all be praying to increase our faith. But Jesus says that if you have the faith of a mustard seed, then you could say to this tree, uproot itself, and it would obey you. Now, when I was in Catholic school, another memory I have is that I remember my teacher giving us little mustard seeds, and they are really small. And I remember asking, really? Now, come on. I at least have that much faith, right? I remember I was kind of that way as a kid. That's not true. I know I can't move trees, so you're telling me that I don't even have that much faith? For the longest time, I thought it was a judgment on how little faith I really had. And then I heard a homily that said that people often interpret Jesus as criticizing how little faith. And that's kind of how I did it. When it can also be read that Jesus is saying you don't need a lot of faith to make great things happen when God is there. And of course, it's kind of like the glass half full or half empty. But reading it this way, it's not that you don't have that much faith, but that's all you need for God. God doesn't require much. Even people with small faith, with little faith, can do amazing things. It just has to be real faith. Real faith is engaging in the event, and it's helping someone in need. Spectator faith is just believing, and maybe not real faith at all. And so a person with real faith is engaged in the battle. He's one of the players on the field. He's suited up or ready ready to be called whenever the coach calls him forward. And that's very different than saying, I believe that there's a God, but if there isn't one, it wouldn't matter because I'm not risking too much of my life. I was in RCIA this morning and we were reflecting on this reading, and one of the participants brought up the idea of today, if you're watching the news, how there is like sort of quiet quitting, where people just kind of do just as much as the minimum amount they need to do. They've pretty much done very little, but enough to not get fired. So they pretty much quit already. So they call it quiet quitting, sort of the minimalist amount. And unfortunately, that can be so true in our faith as well. What's the minimum I need to do to check the box off? One great way of telling the difference between just believing and having faith is for us to ask ourselves how much of our lives are different because we believe, because we are believers who have faith in God. How much have I risked really for God? What price have I paid for believing in God? Our faith has thousands of martyrs who can say, I paid with my life. Others have paid with their torture when they've been, that they've had to endure, even still today in parts of the world when they're forced to deny their faith in God. Some with the sacrifices they make to go on missions or to help the poor and the suffering. Some have given their free time and volunteered and lived out the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. Some have kind of professed their faith with much abuse coming back. But what's for sure is that real faith is engaging, it's active, and it's effective. It's not just a spectator sport. And why I like that story about the circus is in that high wire act is that to just believe that he can do it has no bearing on my life if he fell. Now, it would not be a pretty sight if he did, if I'm sitting in the stands and now he's on the ground, right? And I'd have something to talk about for the rest of my life that I was there. But if I had to sit on his shoulders, it would be very important to me that he made it across. See, my friends, faith without living it out in trusting God, without an active engagement in our lives, is really faith that sits only on the level of belief and not faith really at all. Because by definition, faith must include active participation, must involve our whole self. And it's placed in the truth that's very important, that what we believe is true. So much that I'll risk my whole life for it. And in some sense, when we say the creed in a few minutes, note that we do not say, I believe that there is a God. I believe that Jesus is the only begotten Son. Or I believe that there is a Holy Spirit. Instead, we say, I believe in one God, in Jesus Christ, and in the Holy Spirit. So too with our young people, one of the things we can teach them is what we believe, and we can teach them to have faith in what we believe. And the difference of that, to get to that level requires something a lot more than memorizing and repeating a list of ideas. The second part is much harder because it causes us to ask ourselves if we just believe or if we have faith in what we believe. I know you know the difference. It's not just believing like your spouse, but believing in your spouse. And so, reading the gospel today, God says he really doesn't need a lot of faith to make things happen. Little faith will do you. But it has to be real faith. Real faith that really risks something that you place into God's hands and watch what he does. And so the question facing us today is, do we just believe? Or do we have faith? Faith, no matter how much still one has, will always still allow God to work amazing things.